welcome along to the Edie Extra stage at ED24, the UK's biggest corporate sustainability experience of the year. Edie Extra is going to be a new channel that we're setting up to get Edie closer to our audience and to the individuals, teams, projects and organisations driving corporate climate action in the UK and beyond. We're starting this off here at ED24, where we've got a series of quick-fire discussions taking place on this dedicated ED Extra stage, with a live audience also tuning in. We hope to bring short but sweet, thought-provoking discussions on some of the hottest topics facing sustainable businesses at the moment. If you're not familiar with me, I'm Sarah. I'm content editor at edie. And joining me for my first session is Amir Sokolowski, Director of Climate at CDP. For this session, we're focusing on the EU's Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, CSRD. We'll be covering how you can prepare for compliance, how to go above and beyond compliance, and how to stay ahead of the curve with this and other interlocking standards. So thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks for having me.
I'm sure that for most people, CDP needs no introduction, but for those who aren't familiar, a quick intro to the organisation and your work there would be fantastic.
I love your optimism that CDP needs no introduction. Usually does. CDP is the oldest and largest private sector global reporting platform. We report to us in 2023, reported over 2/3 of global market capitalization. Essentially, we create a questionnaire, and lest you make mistakes, it's not one page, it's 191 pages on issues of climate, biodiversity, forests, water, plastics. I myself am the director of the climate team within CDP, and I lead the thought leadership, so how things integrate and will go forward in the sort of game of cat and mouse that is following and being slightly ahead of reporting standards.
Fantastic. And I know that climate disclosure is the oldest, biggest and longest running CDP disclosure platform. So how does that work overlap with CSRD? How have you guys been inputting to the design and launch of CSRD?
So we work very closely with with EFRAG, who are the body that created the sustainability reporting standards, the ESRS, that are an elaboration of the CSRD. In an attempt to align, CDP is quite often recognized as the place where lots of these themes come together. So our goal in the end is to create regulation and then move beyond it. We've been working with EFRAG, we've been working with GRI, we've been working with ISSB to ensure that at least the data collected within CDP follows the principle of write once and report many. So to ensure that.
Great, and we can come on to, I think, the overlap between CDP, other standards and this standards, because we know that a lot of people are concerned about having to produce lots of different reports with lots of different information, so the need for interoperability, but it probably bears taking a step back and looking at what CSRD is and what it intends to do. From my understanding, this is a new standard that will replace the non-financial reporting directive in the EU, aiming to better embed the bloc's new and updated environmental and social goals. The CSRD became mandatory this January, and there's an expansion on the cards in January 2025 to around 50,000 businesses. But from your point of view, what are the other sort of key need to knows about the CSRD for newbies?
So first of all, for newbies, be aware the EU does nothing simply. So I'm going to give the overarching simplification of what it does. There are a few elements. I'm just going to start by the expansion. So the expansion will happen on the 1st of January every year until 2028, if I'm not mistaken, or 2029, constantly expanding to less sophisticated and different bodies. What is it and what will it do? The CSRD is meant to ensure that reporting on sustainability issues and the impact that they might have is coherent. Without going into the details of what that means and how it's interoperable, it expands in 3 or 4 elements. First of all, what everyone will probably have heard of, it includes something called double materiality. So it's not just the impact, you don't need to only calculate the impact that environmental impact will have on your business, but rather potential impacts that you will have on the surroundings. That's the first. The second is a very large expansion of assurance. So limited assurance hopefully to reasonable assurance. So the data that you supply needs to be assured that it aligns with the standards. And the third is, of course, the breadth of it. And the last expansion, which is, I think, the 1st of January 2028, but I would have to check, or 29, is to non-EU companies. So if you are not an EU company but have a branch within the EU, you will also have to report. And that's very important to the greater picture that you alluded to about interoperability and other pieces of legislation as they come out.
That's what I was going to ask, is in like, has Brexit impacted the scope of this? Was it in train before Brexit was on the horizon?
It was in train before Brexit. Again, the EU takes things slowly. Yes, I think the second most impacted, other than the US, are going to be UK companies. At least 1,000 have been mapped right now that will have to report in accordance with CSRD. You may have heard that the SEC, after 2 years of deliberations, released a rule about reporting for environmental impact reporting as well. And there's a lot of criticism around whether or not it should include materiality, et cetera, et cetera. What's important to remember is that a lot of the companies that are going to have to report to that are also going to be under the scope of CSRD in, let's say, 2028. For the rest of the discussion, it might be 29.
And I think I wanted to talk about loopholes with materiality as well. Am I right in thinking that there are certain issues that you can't say are not material to your business without a reasoned explanation?
So I guess there's a spectrum that you walk around when you're asking for information. You can say, tell me whatever you want. You can say, tell me whatever you want in this field. You can say, tell me whatever you want in this field, but tell me why you haven't spoken about these issues. You can say, tell me whatever you want about these, tell me why you haven't spoken about these issues, and show me the methodology that you have done to assess that. And then you can say, tell me about all of these issues and do so in the following way. Now, we haven't quite reached the final one for many reasons, some of them political, some of them logical. The environmental impact technology nexus is constantly changing. If you actually did things that were too firm, then you'd also limit your future expansion and calculation of environmental impact. But there's also the question of encouraging effort. So right now, what you're asked to do is to report, express scopes 1, so scopes 1, 2, and 3, as well as other impacts. There are adverse impact principles. The number of them is give or take 30, of which mandatory are 9 financial, plus it's a very legal conversation, but they help to guide you. And they say, show me your material, show me what your impact is, but also prove to me why. If you're saying it's not material to me, tell me why. So that's, sorry. I never shut up, so you have to shut up.
No, we've got an audience here that I'm sure will want the specific details, and I know we can't go into 30 points and all the pages of this. I would say we've skirted around the issue of interoperability, which I do want to come on to and ask essentially what's being done to make sure that the CSRD is interoperable with voluntary initiatives like CDP, but also some things that are mandatory in certain jurisdictions, like, for example, the TCFD in the UK.
I should have followed your lead at the beginning and explained a bit more about CDP to express the differentiation, how it's used. So CDP has the biggest data collection questionnaire, and this is not me plugging for the NGO, it's rather saying the reason that it is incorporated in these discussions, it's the only source of raw data on the private sector. And the way we ask questions is usually the biggest burden for sustainability officers. Therefore, CSRD, well, IFRAG, which is the NGO that was in charge of the standards, communicated with us from the first, lest we ask questions that are not useful. There's, in the 23 years that we exist, I'm having a problem with years now, so it's either 23 or 24. In the 23 years that we exist, we've established a way of reporting. A lot of you will be interested in how do you establish reporting within your firm. We've established those structures, so it was important for CSRD that those structures be maintained, well, for IFRAG. At the same time, obviously, a lot of you will have heard about the ISSB, the International Sustainability Standards Board, which is a global standard. And they've interacted as well. We have incorporated them. There is an appendix, or there used to be an appendix in the ESRS about how they align with ISSB. The same is true about discussions with GRI. So you can look, ISSB requires you to report things that are material to your corporation, let's say, that impact you. GRI requires you to walk that middle line and report things that are material. That could include your impact externally and how that'll impact you. CSRD and the standards, so the ESRS, require double materiality. So they require you to do both. However, they all follow the same line. They all are based on the task force, acronyms, Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosure, and I'm not going to say that again, TCFD, recommendations from 2017, and they follow the same structure. So what is your governance? What is your strategy? What are the risks and opportunities, very broadly speaking, and which metrics do you use? And more and above. But that is the first and the basis of how they are or aim to be at least partially interoperable.
And we've got something else on the horizon. So something that's been taking up a lot of my time in recent weeks is another acronym, the CSRD or CSDDD, this Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, which has faced like a much rockier passage through the EU than CSRD, and that will build upon this by essentially implementing new requirements for businesses to be held responsible for the flouting of environmental rules and human rights rules across their value chain. It also includes a net zero transition plan mandate. So how is that shaping up? Is that interoperable? Do people need to be worried about this as well?
Can I lean back for that one? Because yes. First of all, I'm much less of an expert for the CSDDD, but I will say that the logic of the CSRD is this. We cannot, which I alluded to before, we cannot predict and require you to report everything. Think as lawyers, because unfortunately I do. You cannot be required to report everything because we can't predict everything. So instead of it going through litigation, you're saying, I'm not checking what your result is. I'm going to check that the process for due diligence is sufficient. What the CSRD does as well, again, I'm not an expert in this to that extent, but is also combine in a significantly more explicit way the S and the E of ESG. And transition plans are requested elsewhere as well. They're a common feature. Again, not plugging CDP, but released a technical paper, and it still features 3 years ago, and still features in what would an ambitious transition plan look like. It is quite interesting to say, and I will use a bit of our stats, there's good news and bad news for both, right? It's a whole universe, because you could also mention the carbon border adjustment mechanism and how that will impact on the way that you calculate your scope 3. It's a whole mechanism. I think it's really interesting to say the good news is 90% of global market capitalization report to CDP and already align at least partially with some of this. The bad news is that only 1%, only 140 companies in Europe try to align to all of the adverse impacts that are required. Now, it's not as terrible as it sounds. What happens with the rest is that they sometimes align with that, they go in and out because it's never been mandatory. Climate has been the thing that's been mainstream. What the CSRD does is say climate is one facet. Which is strange for the Directive of Climate to say, but climate is one facet of a broader environmental impact. And you need to stop looking at it on its own. And I think as guidance for where to go and how to start reporting is to stop thinking of systems that are parallel, that collect only data on climate, for example. They will collect data on impacts in general. I should have stopped earlier, I'm stopping.
No, not at all. It's super important, I think, to embed all of this. Is something we get asked a lot, is essentially like, how can I stop my board from getting carbon tunnel vision? So hopefully the CSRD offers some solutions there. And I think it's important to also look at restructuring, not only strategizing and calculations around that, but reporting. So from my understanding, it's not just that you log on to different panels and submit data for all of these things. They'll actually look at your corporate sustainability reporting. So what advice would you give to businesses looking to do a shake-up of their annual reporting with CSRD in mind?
A shake-up is an assumption that they already have one for sustainability, which I'd be delighted to know that all companies do. And the reason I mention that is if they haven't arrived at the moment of a shake-up, they have to start internally with having a structure for the collection of data. To to understand what their scope 3 is, what their impact is, and as I've already said, to not think of it as climate only. In the coming years, it is beyond a shadow of a doubt that environmental impacts in general will be awarded the same place. So that's the first thing. And if you're doing a shake-up, it's understanding that in many places, this is not just going to be, as we never wanted it to be, just a sustainability issue. You have to have internal departmental collaboration. So your legal department, obviously, but your CFO, which that was the intention of TCFD, but if it hasn't happened so far, this is the point in which it must. You have to start understanding what certification means, what the assumptions are. I'm sorry, I'm taking a breath. I do believe, and this is why I joined CDP, CDP does provide guidance. So we do provide a platform in which we walk you across all of those. To try and follow BBC guidelines, there is other consultation available, obviously, but the one I know best is mine. And the guidance of it is much more important than the other things that you look at. So you look at the scoring and the question, it's exactly how to walk. But I think the most important switch that you have to do is the one in your mind that understands that this is not going to be tracking your impact anymore. This being the ecosystem in general. It's going to be tracking your efforts to a very large extent. What are the processes that you have in place? How transparent are they? And how ahead of the curve do they attempt to remain? So to sincerely try and track what your potential impacts are, to try and align, there are best standards in almost everything. To try and, yes, CDP provides what they are in almost every field, but also in general, try and align and find for your sector specifically what that means. Having a science-based target validated is very, very helpful, and soon the SBTN will enter. So it's science-based target for nature, not just climate. Again, I will stop myself.
It's interesting that you say that this is more of like a mindset shift and a skills shift, really, rather than just a tick box. So I guess I would close by asking how we can start to get the ball rolling with things like making boards more climate competent or embedding this into people's jobs so that the mindset shift happens.
I feel very uncomfortable about giving a silver bullet tip. I just want to put that out as a provisor. I think, again, what the TCFD, what we've been trying to do is to try and link risk with environmental impact and financial value. It's very much what CDP does, but it's very much as humanity what we've been trying to do. Right? Finance is, money is a proxy of actions we think are valid. And we have been trying to incorporate that. So if you look at it in that way, getting your board to understand the risks and opportunities associated is the basic first point. Getting someone on the board in a particular board structure that has qualifications of someone who can speak to it from within, both lends you credibility, but also will provide a more coherent steer. And there has to be a transparent mandate from your board when someone is accountable. If I have to do something, then I probably will, rather than, I don't know, someone else will do this. I think I told you to do that last month, right? So these are very basic steps. But given that the purpose of the CSRD, given the purpose of the ecosystem in general, is to track your impact for a collaborative effort going forward, it can never be a tick box. So you need to have the qualifications in-house as well.
Fabulous. Well, I can't think of a better note to end our discussion on, Amir. We are fresh out of time for this discussion on the ED Extra stage. Thank you so much for your time. I hope everyone in the audience has enjoyed this session. I know that the audience is absolutely jam-packed, which is great to see. We'll be back for more conversations on this stage throughout the conference, bringing you news from across the world of sustainable business, and you can stream all of this back on our ED Extra channel after the event. So for people without headphones, if you didn't catch all of that, a recording will be made available shortly. So be sure to check out our website for that. You can also find ED Extra on SoundCloud, Apple Podcast and Spotify, so wherever you get your podcasts. But until later, thank you and goodbye.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.